Hello there, welcome to day 8 of Creator Mass 2019, where we make some products for IMVU with a Christmassy theme. And today we're going to continue on with the beanie hat for Realz, the beanie hat that we started yesterday. And we got into IMVU, so we tested it to make sure that it fit and everything looked okay. So today we're going to carry on with that. Because our previous attempt looked more like a headscarf, and this kind of does already. It looks like one of those hairnet things. Not quite sure what they call those. Factory workers wear to keep their hair out of the way. So that's yesterday, but what we did before, where is it? Ended up looking a little bit like a headscarf. So source files are available for these, by the way, so if you are wanting to get those, you can do so and play around with them. So that's the .blend files. You'll need Blender 2.8. Oh, you'll need 2.81 actually for these, but you can play around with those. So where did we get to yesterday? So yesterday we got as far as this rather lumpy looking thing. Oh, we need our reference images. Beanie. Lippy beanie. Won't show these on screen because my copyright. People are a bit funny that way. Right, so we've got a basic structure that's fitting the head. So what we can do now is start to essentially detail this up a little bit. And of course we're doing everything in edit mode. But what we're going to start doing today, or what we can start doing now, is we can start changing the structure of the mesh. So for example, what we want to do is add a brim of sorts, and then we'll start adding folds in the cloth or in the fabric, but we need to change the structure of the mesh to be able to do that. So at the moment we can't really do anything because the mesh is sort of all over the place, because it suits what we did before. So what we need to do now is start altering the structure of the mesh so that we've got more to play with. So we can add some edges, or we can subdivide some quads. So we can do that either by using the knife tool. So if you press the K key and we get this little, so we can cut across, use the structure that's available, or we can just where is it? Triangulate faces. So this, as we discussed yesterday, splits faces into their core components, which are triangles. And what we can do with this is use this to then allow us, or give us room. So double tap to slide edges, or use that. So we want slide vertex. So click drag. And we're going to start seeing, because we're changing the structure, we're going to get these things cropping up, but we can ignore those for now. So we need to do this on this side. So it was this face and this face. Whoops. So triangulate. And we've got our two edges, and then switch to vertex mode, edge slide, click drag, select, click drag. And then this face here, split that. So that edge is okay. It's aligned itself where we want it to go. But this one isn't, so we have to rotate that. So select, edge, rotate clockwise. So what we've now got is something that we can use. So this large loop that follows all the way around here and onto the other side. We can use that to define a stiffer brim. So let's do some shaping. We can dissolve these edges here and get rid of those, because what we want to do is flatten this area out a little bit. So we can do that two ways. We can either double tap and edge slide to collapse everything together, or no, we don't want those two, we want these two, so that when we do that we retain these faces. But what we do is collapse the vertexes more than anything. It's collapsing the vertexes to there. So edge slide or double tap your keyboard. Whoops. Let's just double tap, and that'll collapse that edge. And we can do the same vertex wise. So select a vertex, double tap, close that, double tap. And then we need to remove doubles. So select all, mesh, clean up, merge by distance. So let's have a look at what we've got. That's okay. let's get rid of these. So double tap, select them, double tap, drag across. Those two, double tap, get rid of those. So what we're doing, we're keeping the general shape of the mesh, but by changing its structure, so we can do some better edits. So what we want to do now, so what we're going to do is create a fold along this edge. But to make this easier, what we want to do is try and keep as much as much of this structure on this side quadratic. It just makes it easier to manipulate the structure in the mesh. So these triangular faces that we've now created, we can select those and convert them to quads. We don't need that to be, in fact we might be able to do it with that one as well, quad. Because what this will do, so if we try to add a loop cut now, it'll do all sorts of weird things, because loop cuts are stopped by triangles. So if we make these quads, the loop cut can travel, whoops, where's it gone? Along the structure much better. Oh, we don't want it to do that. What we want it to do is actually run. So what we might have to do is split those back into triangles. So the loop cut is restricted to this front section of the mesh. So if we add the loop cut using the loop cut tool, so the tool highlights the path that's taken or it can take, and that's what we want. So click and we can drag that close to the top. Deactivate. We should be able to, whoops, scale that out. Dagnabbit. Yeah, so scale. And then we'll have to make some adjustments to these vertexes. Double tap, slide those. Let's make the front Looking a bit like a fur hat now. I want it to be a thick woolen beanie. So that's okay. So we need to tidy up this section. To do that on both sides. Faces. I'll do the shortcuts, make this quicker. Control T, Control T. Need to turn that edge. So what we've just done there is restructured the mesh, so we now have a face that we can start to, well, it follows this edge, because what we're going to do is add another edge and that'll create a fold. That's on the other side. Turn that edge. So all the shortcut keys, this is where Blender comes into its own with the shortcut keys. Once you start to familiarize yourself with the shortcut keys, so we're toggling between selection type or element type. So the number 1 is vertex, number 2 is edges, and number 3 is faces. And once you're in edit mode, and you can see the selector at the top here, it changes depending on what we're in. It becomes much easier, or quicker I should say, it's not easier, it's quicker to do to carry out certain functions. And then it's Alt J, join faces together. So what we can also do on the inside is extrude that. And shrink that in towards the head so that we fill that gap, so we don't have to then basically make the mesh two-sided, which we want to try and avoid. And where you can, it doesn't necessarily have to be completely symmetrical, but where you can, try and manipulate both sides of the mesh at the same time. But having said that, we don't necessarily want to make it completely symmetrical. Oops. Okay, that'll do. So we need to chop this face and this face. So, let's see, and this face. Let's get rid of those skeletons again. So outliner, we want to hide all this text that's distracting us. So outliner, deselect, and it'll hide all the bones, armatures, and the names. Because they are separate, this is an accessory file, so each one of these is a separate object. So in order to, you can't universally disable the names from being shown on screen. So the easiest way is just to hide them. So that one, on the other side, that one. So let's split across there. Same on this side. So now we're starting to add more structure where we need it, so that we can create quads that we can then manipulate more easily. So we're going to add a loop cut here, and it terminates on this edge because that's a triangle and it does the same thing on the other side. So click, and just drag that down a little bit and that's fine. Scale. So now we can create a fold in the cloth, and we can start deforming the mesh a bit more. Oh, and one of the advantages of using the shortcut keys as well is that the scale tool is active, but we can manipulate the vertexes. We can manipulate the vertexes by pressing the shortcut keys independently of the widget or the manipulation mode that's active by the selection widgets. So we're in scale, but we can press the hit the R key to rotate, and we can rotate things. Press the G key, and we can move things. And those keys function. We can even do the S key for scaling. Those operate independently of the active widget. Yes, we do too, Panic. So let's have another quick look at our source images. So let's add a fold up top here. So we want a fold going around the top. So we can use the structure we've already got, and it'll terminate on this triangle on both sides. So edge cut, and we can probably just slide that backwards. Scale. So if you've been watching these streams, it may have been noticed that a lot of this is just guesswork. So we're looking at the shapes that we're trying to represent, and we're just guessing the best way of representing whatever those shapes happen to be. So there isn't a specific formula in terms of making things look the way that we want them to look, it's all guesswork. So we don't want this to be too symmetrical. So add another one, and that's probably going to go all the way around there. Yes, it'll go all the way around this section. So loop cut, just the one. Scale that up. But drop that down. Add another one. In fact, we might be able to use that one. Oh, we've got to watch out for the back of the head, so shrink that. Add another loop cut. Where's the tool? There it is. No, let's do it the incremental way. So you want to, as we've been saying in the other streams, don't add too much detail in one go, because it's too easy to lose control over the mesh. So you always want to be in control of what you're doing. That looks like a really thick woolen beanie now. Mr. Beanie Man would be proud. Whoops, so we've got to watch out for that. One more. So that is our woolen beanie, more or less. that's our woolen beanie. There we go. That's what we should have done the first time, but it ended up looking like a headscarf. So let's just save this. Save as... This is number 6. Come on. Right, so that is our beanie. Whoops, that was kind of a bit wonky. So what we can do now, so that's the basic shape, and we don't necessarily need to add too much more structure to this. So what you'll often see some people doing, let's enable wireframe, is subdividing this and turning objects like this, which is... Oh, that's because it's got the avatar in it. So it's... So down at the bottom here in the status bar, let me see if I can magnify that. Whoops. Down in the bottom left there, we can see we've got the object selected. We're in edit mode, so we've selected everything. And down in the bottom left, we can see how structurally complex the object is. And our object is only 308 triangles, and that's the measurement that for IMVU purposes is the one that you want to pay attention to. So whenever you're doing something and you want to check, because we have a budget with IMVU, everything should be within a certain number of polygons, and we can check that in edit mode. We select everything, and we want to pay attention to the tris count. In this instance, it's 308. Faces is incidental. That's just a different measurement for tris, but it's tris which is the important one, because that's what IMVU sees when you export your mesh. So when you then go and look at, just save over that. So when you look at your object in IMVU, you've got your texture selected, you'll see that it says, in this instance, 105 triangles. It doesn't say 105 faces, it says triangles, because IMVU, like most games or rendering engines or whatever you want to call them, they break everything down into their core elements, which is basically vertexes, edges, and triangles. So you'll see some meshes. I won't do that. I was just about to go and load up. I was looking at something today, for example, that had a beanie, simple beanie, that was a less complicated shape than this, and it had something like 20,000 triangles. For an object like that, or for an object like this, that is serious overkill. Don't need that many polygons. But with that said, what we can do is change the profile where it needs to be more round by adding structure to the mesh. So we don't necessarily need to do anything to the overall mesh. Let's add one more loop. Speaking of that, with that said, whoops, add a loop cut across the top there. Because that is a little flat. And we can add, whoops, So break that face and the face on the other side. Then we can break that. So again, we're going to do some reorganization of the surfaces. So select that edge, turn it, select that edge, turn that. Same on the other side. So what did we do? Edges. That's it. So we can make a quad from that. Turn that edge. Turn that one. And we make a quad. Has that collapsed on itself? Yes, that's collapsed. So yesterday we went over this. Depending on, so we've got our quads. Whoops. We've got our quads, and they're made from triangles. If it's a flat surface, if it's a flat plane, it'll be flat. But depending on the orientation of the vertexes at each corner, we can make the face collapse on itself, because there's an edge that divides a quad. So there's our quad outline. Whoops. Elite drawing skills. So there's our quad, defined by those four edges, and there's the diagonal. Depending on which way that diagonal is pointing, whether it's top right, bottom left, or top left, bottom right, this face that we're looking at now will appear to collapse in on itself. So at the moment, so here is the quad we're looking at, and at the moment this edge is making it convex, which we want, but if that edge were rotated, it'll make the shape concave because it collapses. So let's make that a quad. And we can add another one. Maybe, yeah. Let's see. No, so I have to manually cut this from that vertex. So that's the K key. Click. Terminate there. Don't necessarily want it to be too round. Right, so that is our beanie. Right, so what we were getting onto before we got distracted. So the edges, as we're looking at this face on, this leading edge around here is quite faceted compared to the face, which is much rounder. So instead of adding tons and tons of structure to the mesh by subdividing, which is completely unnecessary for most of these types of objects, what we can do is subdivide the leading edges that we're going to see that essentially set the profile of the object. And by that, we essentially mean, let's get rid of the head. So what we're going to do is subdivide these edges, edge, subdivide, and we can then select those. So that's a loop select. So either Alt and click. So if you click one of the edges, there are a couple of ways of doing this. So select an edge, select, linked. Whoops, that's the wrong one. When you use the shortcut keys so much, it's having to remember what the, there we go, loops, edge loop, that's the one. So select an edge, select edge loop, and if you want to select multiple loops, just select one edge, shift click another edge from another loop, same thing again, and select both of them. And then what we can do with this is just round the profile. So now we've got something that's not quite as harsh, and we can tidy up these faces, split those, same again on this edge, select, 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 shift, select, 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 subdivide, same again, so select, shift, select, select loops, edge loops, and then what we can do, scale those outwards a little bit, make that a bit more round. So if you put the head back in place, it's now less angular. So there is our beanie. That looks more like a beanie, big woolen beanie. Not bad for 3 hours, including yesterday's. Right, so save this, exit, file, save as, 7. So, of course, because we've added all this structure, it means our UV maps are going to be a bit wonky now. So we've messed up the UV maps. So we can do a couple of things here. Let's take a look at the UV map first. So that was, well, that with all the additional loop cuts and things that we've added to it, that's the basic profile. Was the UV map, but we've got a 512 by 256 that we can take advantage of here. So what we might be able to do is break the UV map into sections using some of the natural hiding places that we've created. So for example, where we've got the brim around here, that is a natural hiding place. We've also got one here. That is a natural hiding place for a seam. And what that means is that rather than the texture being all scrunched up the way that it is, so at the back of the mesh, which is, whoops, let's check. So it's those tiny faces at the back which actually occupy quite a lot of space within the object. So that's these ones at the back. Those really need a lot more space dedicated to them. So what we can do by breaking the UV map into sections, using these natural, they're not breaks in the surface, but what they are areas of the object where we can hide seams, or where UV seams are not quite as obvious as they might otherwise be. We can use those to our advantage and lay out the UV map so that we get more texture space being used. So to do that, we have to lay down some seams. So on the mesh, we need to be in edge mode, and all we do is select, shift click the edges we want to lay a seam along. So let's try cutting that up. We need to get rid of the head again. Hide the head. So what we can do is, yeah, so use the back of the mesh. Whoops. So what we've done is traced a path in a way that it'll split this front section into its own section, and if we unwrap right now, we'll have two sections. So this will be section 1 and this will be section 2, the whole of that. But we can go a bit further. We can actually, as we were discussing, create a seam down there, which means we've got 3 sections. But what we're also doing is splitting the UV maps so that it lays out flat. So without this seam at the back, if we were to unwrap this, let's do that. So let's first place a seam. So for that, once you've got your edges marked, from the edge menu, just mark a seam. And the edges will highlight orange. That means we've got a seam, and it's a continuous loop. It's a closed loop, so that means, or that confirms, whoops, that that section will be split off into its own unit. So if we select all and unwrap, we get 2 sections. Let's move this into the grey area so we can see it easily. So we've got 2 sections. So that's our front section. And this is the remainder of the back. And already, just by doing that, we can see that the texture density, that is the amount of texture, the amount of this that occupies a given area has increased at the back just from just doing that. But what we want to do in this particular instance, what we can do is we can take advantage of the fact that we've got a loop, essentially, a UV loop. But what we can do is add an edge that will split that. So if we were to unwrap this again, this section will lay out, well, it'll be relatively flat. UV, unwrap. See, that's what it's done. And what that does is it gives us a bit more room to play around with to increase the texture density. It also makes it easier to fit within other UV elements, so we can play around with flatter shapes more easily than we can with rounder shapes. So we'll do that again using this natural indentation in the mesh, and we can terminate at an edge that we've already marked, which is here on this edge that folds around under there. Same again, that terminates here on that seam. So select our edges, shift click, edge, mark seam, and that section at the top, because it's terminating where it is on the other side as well, will be a naturally open UV section. So select all, UV unwrap, and that's the bit that we've just created. So again, we can already see there's even even better increase in the distribution of the texture. I wonder if we might be able to. So if we lay this out now, so we're in the editor, we've got the transform mode set so that we've got the widget, and we can just use the widget to position our UV sections. Which way is the front? So that's the front. So we want to scale that up, use as much texture space as we can, rotate that. Just reorganize the placement of these. So that then becomes our UV layout. And that, generally speaking, will make it easier for people to paint their derivations, their textures, because they've now got definitive edges that they can paint around to create shading and shadows, which we can add through Vertex colors, Vertex painting. Yeah, so that looks okay, because we could, if we really wanted to, We could also split the back. So if we wanted to, we could split a seam, place a seam on the back edge, but we want to try and keep this back end as whole and complete as possible to make it easy to paint. I wonder if we can rotate that. Try and squeeze as much as we can out of the UV map. So you don't always need to leave your UVs in their default positions or locations or their size, but if you do adjust the size, just keep in mind that that tends to alter the detail in certain areas, because you're increasing the amount of texture that's mapped over a particular face. So we can see that these faces have slightly less texture than these ones, but because of the structure that we've unwrapped, that's going to be relatively unavoidable without making the mesh too complicated. So that's our UV map. Need to just do a quick check. So in material properties, what we can do is enable backface culling, and that'll just tell us quickly that the mesh and all the faces are pointing in the right direction, which is outwards. So that's okay. So layout. So that is our beanie. Save as 8. So what we can do now we can add some UV painting to this. Not UV painting, some Vertex painting. Select mesh, Vertex paint, access the tool in the sidebar, view, no it's not, it's tool, and for this we just really want to just add shading rather than color. We'll just paint the vertexes. Whoops. That should be quite dark because it's at the back of the neck, back of the head. And then what we want to do is add a bit of shading to the folds that we've created. Doesn't have to be too dark, just tinted. And anywhere the avatar is going to shade the mesh, or is likely to. So you want to use grayscale rather than color, because if you use color, it'll interfere with textures that people put on the mesh when they derive from it. So white on any surface or any vertex that should be non-shaded yeah, that should be okay. Oh, and of course we lose the ability to see our vertex colors when we switch mode. So let's save that. Whoops, save as. Nine. And then we can export this. So before we do that, because we've added some structure to this, edit mode, select all, modifiers. Oh no, wrong one. Not modifiers. Object data properties. We want to make sure that our vertex group that we created previously for testing, we want to make sure that that is associated with all the vertexes that are all over the mesh now, that we've added loads of. So make sure everything is selected, and then click the assign button, and we can double check this with deselect and select, and it should select everything, and it does. Okay, then double check. Need to unhide the skeletons, hide that one, we want the head. So to double check this, select the armature that controls the mesh, which is the head bone, or the armature for that represents the head as an accessory item. Select that, pose mode, select a bone, press the R key, and it does. And as we've said before, this does two things. We're testing to make sure that the armature controls the mesh, which it does. And we're also testing to make sure that when the armature is moved and manipulated, that it doesn't distort the mesh, because with we've either missed a vertex or a vertex has been misassigned to a vertex group. We want to avoid both of those. So we can just save that again. You don't need to save your file this many times, but this is just for the purposes of demonstration so that we have restore points to go back to should there be any errors or issues. Right, now as this is an accessory, deselect everything and then File, Export, FBX. So we've got all our previous exports, that's fine. So for an accessory, make sure selected objects is deselected. Everything else is okay. In geometry, apply modifiers, that's optional, so that can be left. In armatures, always disable add leaf bones, and we don't need any animation, so we can disable that as well, and then just export. And that exports. What that does is it forces Blender to export everything that's included in the scene, and we can filter all of that stuff out when we import, which is what we'll do next. But for some reason, accessory items don't always export correctly when you do the normal thing, which is to select the objects that you actually want to export. For some reason, accessories don't behave very well when we do that, so it's best just to deselect everything and force Blender to export everything that's included in the scene. So let's take a look at that. Create mode, new derivable, female, accessory. That gets us the glasses. Go. So that's the default. So we want FBX import, load FBX. We need to find the file that we've just created. Oh, 710. Should have been 810. Yeah, so 710, open. So we've got the select skeleton root dialog. Always select the one for accessories at least that starts root node, and that's always going to be 2 bones, 1 mesh. So select. There is our beanie mesh. Bring that in. The material is red because we've used a virtual material in Blender. It's not real. It's not a real bitmap or image. So IMVU makes that red just to warn us of that fact. But that's okay otherwise. This is a female accessory, so that's mesh ID 2. Apply scale 0.01 and then import. It's going to overwrite the default material, which is good, and then import changes. Apply changes, and there is our beanie. So let's replace the texture. Meshes, edit. Where is our Christmas wrapping? It's that one. Beanie cloth. Apply changes, and there is our beanie. Don't need that, we don't need two-sided. Enable vertex colors. So there is our beanie. Obviously, depending on what you want your texture to be, you can add a wool pattern or something to it to suit the object. Let's save that. Save as Creator Mass 2019. This is actually episode 8. It's 1. So that's a pretty straightforward texture replacement. If you want to create a texture map, back in Blender, select your object, UV editing, make sure everything is selected, obviously, select all. So this is our UV map. That's also our texture map, because what we can do, don't have to select everything, but select everything. And from the UV menu, we can export the UV layout, and that is what creates our texture map. You can change the size, make it bigger or smaller depending on your requirements. Generally speaking, stick with PNG, and we want this to be opaque. So switch that to 1.00. If you make it 0, it just exports as a wireframe, which personal preference. And then name the file UV, and then export. And that creates our UV map. Where is it gone? There it is. And that's a UV map. And that is what you would upload to your product catalog page. And this is what people will use to paint all their shading. So you can augment vertex painting, but it also means that you can align your texture pattern, your textile pattern. So if this was wool, you would create a pattern for this back section that would be round, whereas for these sections it would be different shapes or take on different orientations. So there we have it. Our successfully created beanie hat. That looks rather festive. And then obviously all you need to do next is save the file and then just upload to the catalog. Save the file, create your product images, and then upload. So there we go. A beanie hat, not a headscarf. And that's taken us, so yesterday we did about an hour and a half-ish, and today we're almost an hour and a half again, so 3 hours. But obviously when you're working, because you're not having to explain everything, it'll probably take less than that. But to do an overview, open. Where are we? 7.1. Open. So as our overview, that's what the object started out as. Well, that was the phase after we started from the default cube. We did a little bit of extrusion just to create these two blocks at the back. We made it look like the alien's head, xenomorph's head. And we've created some very, very simple basic structure. So these are loop cuts. so that we can start off by essentially blocking out the shape that we want it to follow, and then adding more detail as we go. Don't start by adding a really dense UV sphere into the scene and then trying to work with that, because it'll just become frustrating. So here we've added a bit more structure, namely these loops along the edge that go around the back, and these ones here that allow us to round the shape a bit more. So that's all we're doing. We're just adding a bit more structure incrementally. So that's number 2. Number 3, a bit more structure, adding a bit more detail. And number 4, I think, was adding the UV map. So we added the UV map, so that is our basic shape that we had. Then number 5, we export tested this. So we got it all set up as an accessory item. So Vertex group, as our Vertex group, and our modifier, the armature modifier. Then we exported that. That gave us this one. So we then knew that everything was in place, it fit the head, nothing was missing. So we then continued on to what we were doing today. So that now meant open 7.6. So then, following on from what we were doing, we were adding more structure, more detail, and just pushing and pulling edges, vertexes, faces to create our cloth folds, clothing folds. So that's number 6. Number 7. So it's just a little bit more detail, a bit more definition. Number 8. Adjusting the UV map or compensating. So we're now corrected or updated the UV map, taking advantage of some of the hidden valleys that we've got in the mesh. And then we're exporting, which is what we've just done, numbered 9 and 10. And of course, if you really wanted to, you could then append. Let's see where it is. Let's try number 6, 8. Append, object, double click. All we've got to do now is find it. Ribbon.mesh. Append that. And you've got a ribbon that you can then add to your hat, which keeps it in line. Oh, we're in global. There we go. Keeps it in line with the theme of the bows. Add that to the back. Or if you wanted to be really fancy, you could duplicate that, turn it around, add it to the front of your beanie. Or being super fancy, add several of them. So duplicate, that's really weird. The widget isn't showing, or isn't properly representing the orientation of the object. So I have to do this old school. And just create a band of ribbons around your beanie hat. Like so. And then export that. That keeps it on theme with ribbons and bows. Christmas themed ribbons and bows. So there we have it. There is our beanie. Finally done. With texture maps if you want to do that. That's a thick woolen beanie. Keep everyone warm. Right, on that note then. Thank you for lurking and watching. Lurkers and watchers. And that was episode 8 of Creator Mouse 2019. Making a beanie for reals. So tomorrow, day 9, not sure what we're going to do, but it'll involve some bows at some point, I guess. So, as they say in China, catch you later.